Okay, I hit the record button, and next I am going to launch this window. I'm clicking on share. Okay, so this is just an initial practice video, and I am making it primarily to work on new things. One issue is that I don't want to keep using the camera here on my computer. And here is a comment from Alexander down there, and he's one of the people from whom I will need help. Other comments before I get into the commentary part of this practice video. In addition to needing a new camera, I'm going to need lighting. Generally, when I give these talks, I will be wearing my contact lenses rather than glasses. Should work on a background and such things. These are not insurmountable obstacles. I could consider what shirt or cap to wear, especially if someone pays me to do so. But at the moment, I don't think that's likely because my channel currently has, I think, 2 followers. All right, so also before I get into the main part, this is an example of one of the types of content in the video or in the Word file that I just developed. I just sent it to Alexander. The content includes commentaries on articles. By the way, I did note I just said don't want to do that. With commentaries on articles, I mentioned that they could be articles by myself or from other people. And this is one that I wrote. I'm one of the co-authors, and obviously I'm the person who wrote most of the words in here. The reason I chose it largely is that it's a Frontiers for Young Minds article. So this is a great example of something that looks approachable to the general public. You can see here on the first page that it was reviewed by a 12-year-old, and it's written at that level. So this is kind of like Bci for dummies, where you're trying to be non-threatening and very friendly and approachable. And if I say, look, this article was meant for preteens, then of course it should be unintimidating to most other people. I also like this picture that they developed, and we'll comment on that. Also, I chose to have the preprint so I could give examples of author queries. Another thing I'm going to do, again, before I get into the actual recording, is point to or maybe use the mouse or something to I don't know if the mouse is visible, to indicate some video post-production things. So for example, when I talk about the picture here, it'd be nice to have arrows pointing to different parts. And when I mention the author queries, that would be nice too. And I guess that's adequate. So I will now begin the actual practice part of the video. Also, don't move around in my chair. Thank you for coming. My name is Brendan Allison. I'm the 3rd author of this paper here. And this was a paper in Frontiers for Young Minds. This is a special type of peer-reviewed publication where the peers who review us, okay, stop, I'll start over again. It's not really a peer-reviewed publication because the peers are 12 years old. Thank you for joining me. My name is Brendan Allison. I'm one of the authors of this article in Frontiers for Young Minds. And this is a special type of publication because unlike most of our scientific publications, which are aimed at experts in the field, here we're instead aiming toward young minds, specifically preteens and people in that age group who not only are not familiar with Bcis, but also, for the most part, haven't really finished their education in terms of mandatory schooling, haven't started college yet, haven't taken a lot of science classes. And so I thought this would be a nice example of a video to try to make people see that Bcis are approachable and understandable. And I may make other videos that are commenting on expert level material, but I thought this would be a nice way to produce an early video to help make people feel more comfortable with Bcis. So this article is titled, How Can Completely Locked In Persons Communicate with a Brain-Computer Interface? And none of us in the author list have the skill to produce this very nice picture at the top of the page. This is another reason why I like this article in the Frontier series is they have professional artists who can help make this look approachable. And so this image here kind of overlaps or helps explain a lot of the initial text. So what's the point of producing a video where I just read all the words there? There is some point, but that's not what I want to do. I want to try to add something to it and make it easier to appreciate. So this is an example of a brain-computer interface based on the EEG. And you'll see in the next page, we have definitions of those terms. And I can even, I guess, go there right now if I'm lucky. Yes. So these terms are defined here. A BCI is a system that translates the user's brain activity into signals for communication. And I should clarify, we used a simplified version for this article. A brain-computer interface is also a system that reads from the brain. That is, systems that write to the brain are not called BCIs. And typically the BCI system is a real-time closed-loop system. And so this is again, we used a fuzzier definition here. BCIs generally present feedback in real time to the user. And with the EEG, these are just sort of squiggly lines on paper is what they look like, or on a monitor. So the EEG measures the brain's electrical activity, and they're not measuring the activity of individual neurons, they're measuring activity of large groups of neurons. And so the first part of this article that I've gotten into so far describes what a BCI and the EEG are. And I also want to address this term about what are completely locked in patients before I get back to the picture and the example of how the system works. So many people have trouble moving. And in most cases, people who have difficulty moving are not locked in or completely locked in or even close to that. So most people who can't move in some way or another still have other ways that they can communicate. Right now, I'm communicating by speaking. You can also see that I'm using my hands to communicate with the computer, such as to move the page up and down and other things to make this video. Most people who have a movement disability, if they can't talk or type, can still use some other way to communicate, such as by blinking. But there are people who have very severe disabilities where any type of movement is not effective for communication. That is, they're not able to blink, at least not reliably. They're not able to use eye control or control their breathing or other ways to send information to the outside world, including other people and devices that they might want to control. And in extreme cases, it may not even be possible for many doctors or family members to determine whether these patients are awake or aware, or even if they're mentally healthy. I mean, how would you tell if somebody's not able to move voluntarily in any way? It's very difficult to communicate. And when I say voluntarily, unfortunately, these people may have involuntary movements. That is, they may have muscle spasms that they can't control, or fasciculations and different problems that are movement but are not voluntary movement. They can't really control these things. And so for such patients, a brain-computer interface, or a BCI, might be the only practical way to communicate. And you can also use BCI-like technology, similar systems, to assess these patients to determine whether or not they're actually awake. Are they able to understand you? Are they able to respond, and so on? So most BCIs use the EEG, and this is an electrode cap that you place on the head. There are many other types of BCIs that can either be non-invasive, meaning they also do not require penetrating the skin, or that are invasive, also called implanted, which means that you're putting an electrode or other type of sensor underneath the skull. And this, of course, requires neurosurgery. There are lots of articles and discussions about invasive and non-invasive BCIs and the relative merits of them, each one. I'm not going to get into them here. I certainly have elsewhere, but both approaches can be useful. It depends very much on the individual patient, the individual user, and their available funding, their desires, their health. Some people may not be able to get implanted BCIs, and a variety of other reasons. So these EEG caps or electrode caps have several different electrodes in them that can sense the brain's electrical activity. And you can pick up electrical activity while people are doing different things. And if you choose to perform a certain mental activity, such as to count a certain flash on the screen or a vibration on your wrist, or if you choose to think about moving your left hand versus your right hand, you can change your own brain activity, thereby changing the EEG that you can pick up from outside the head, and thereby you can communicate with the BCI if you have a system that can decode this brain activity. So if you're thinking about left-hand movement or right-hand movement, well, if you don't have an electrode cap or some other way to pick that up, that's not going to help you very much with respect to a BCI. But if you have an electrode cap that can pick it up and signal processing that can determine the difference between these different brain states that you create, well then, now you have the basis for communication. Now, I'll go back to the preceding page because it has that image that I wanted to talk about. And this is an example of a non-visual BCI. That is, the system does not use any kind of visual information to communicate with the patient. And the reason is that many of these patients cannot see or cannot see reliably. But most BCIs are visual, and in general, BCIs that use the visual modality are faster and more efficient than other types of BCIs. But we're working with a unique group of patients who have different capabilities. And like I said, a key factor of any type of BCI is matching the BCI to the needs and desires of the user, or in this case, the patient. So I've explained how this electrode cap works. And I also want to mention this vibrating tactor on the wrist. So what we did is we put a bracelet on the wrist. And this bracelet or wrist strap or whatever you might want to call it vibrates periodically. And we put one on the left wrist and one on the right wrist. And this is our way of conveying information to the user, the patient, and getting brain activity without vision. So if you can see, the most common approach with this type of BCI, it's called a P300 Bci, which is my favorite. That's what I worked on my PhD thesis and most of my publications. You can get this type of brainwave, which is called a P300, by flashing. You flash letters on a monitor, and you ask someone to count whenever the target letter flashes and ignore everything else. And what happens then is whenever you flash a letter or another item that the user chooses to count, you get a brainwave called the P300. And this P300 reflects that you are paying attention to something. And if you flash something else, then you get no P300 or a much reduced P300. And this approach was first used in a BCI in 1988. That was a famous paper by Farwell and Donchen, were the two scientists responsible for the first P300 BCI. But as I said, we had to come up with a way that doesn't use the visual modality. And we weren't the first to make a non-visual BCI. So people have made BCIs based on hearing or touch. And the system described here can use hearing or touch, but in this example, in this video, I'm just focusing on touch. So the tactors on the wrists are designed to convey touch stimuli. They're also called somatosensory stimuli. And here's the task of the user. What you're asked to do is to silently count each vibration on either the left wrist or the right wrist. And just like the visual example I gave, you should get a P300 after stimuli that you choose to attend and not after stimuli that you choose to ignore. So if we ask someone to please count all the stimuli on the left wrist only, and you then see that every time you illuminate the left wrist, you get something called a P300, well, then that suggests that the person was able to follow that instruction. And that tells you a lot about a patient. It says that the patient is able to understand language, at least, and specifically the language you're speaking, that the patient has enough memory and attentional capacity to continue performing this task over a few minutes. The patient has enough emotional capacity to want to do it, is not overly depressed or otherwise unwilling to do it. Of course, you can choose to not follow the task. This is a voluntary system. It also indicates that the patient is awake at that time and other things about remaining abilities. So for most people, this would not be so informative. So right now, just from the fact that I'm making this video, you can probably say, all right, this person seems to have a decent understanding of the English language and is able to pay attention and focus on a task. It wouldn't really tell you very much if I could use this type of system. But if I were unable to move, if I were in a hospital bed and doctors had said that I'm completely locked in, perhaps comatose or in another state where I might not be able to do these tasks, this can make a huge difference. This is, and has been, we've seen this firsthand, both with patients and their families. This is a huge moment emotionally when people find out that their loved one is there, is able to hear and understand and perform tasks. We've also had the joyous situation before where patients later are able to communicate in other ways or through a BCI, and they remember this moment. They say, yes, we remember when you or a doctor or someone else realized and explained to us or to someone else, hey, this person is in there. It's reasonable to talk to this person. We've told family members, hey, you can come and visit this patient. You can talk to him or her. He can understand you, at least sometimes. So as I mentioned, even with all the technology we have, it can be difficult to determine whether such a patient is awake or asleep without using a BCI, of course. And then another thing you can do is communication. So consider what I just described, where you can ask someone to count stimuli on the left wrist or the right wrist. Well, what if you don't tell them ahead of time? What if you instead say, if you want to answer yes, then count the stimuli on your left wrist. And if you want to answer no, then count the stimuli on your right wrist. So now we've changed this system from being a system for assessing mental function to a system for communication. Now, when we say communicate here, both in the title and in the article, you notice that we're providing very limited communication. That is, they can only answer yes or no. This system does not allow people to spell or move robots around or other sorts of things that other brain-computer interfaces can do. This is just a simple introductory type of system. And once you have this capability to answer yes or no, you can, of course, get into more complex things. You can make rudimentary spellers just by saying yes or no over and over again. But that wasn't really the main goal of what this system was. And this was our first generation device and approach for this. So there are a lot of ways to improve it. And notice this was published in 2018 and it's now 2021. We've gone on to other things such as rehabilitation and prediction. But within this paper, we were just talking about assessment and then communication. And the reason assessment is relevant is that, of course, before you want to try to communicate, you have to assess that patient's mental function. That is, if you're not able to count stimuli on the left side versus the right side, then you would not be able to use this approach to communicate. So we show down here in the next figure that this is an example of communication. So here in this example, you see how people can communicate where you ask a question such as, is your name Maggie or are you in Italy? And the system will then move this arrow, or sorry, this circle over the yes or the no. So the yes and the no reflect the system's perceived answer to that question. And when I say the system's perceived answer, remember that the system may not be working at 100% accuracy. And this is something we address in the paper. So up here we talked about how, sorry, if the system works with 100% accuracy, yeah, so I should practice this, but whatever. If the system is completely accurate, then wonderful. And this is realistic in a lot of cases. That is, many systems are completely accurate. And here is an image of a visual P300 speller, which I should have used earlier in the talk, but this is a practice talk, I'm learning. And in the vibration-based system, you can see here in the top right part of this picture, this is an example of what the EEG looks like for target versus non-target stimuli. So the green line on the bottom there indicates the person's, oh, hey, I should zoom in more. Indicates that the person's, sorry, the green line, which is on the top here, indicates the average brain response to target stimuli. So, for example, the left wrist, if you want to count the left wrist. And then the blue line on the bottom there indicates what you might want to do with the non-target stimuli, the resulting effect. And you can see there's a big difference. You see that there are a couple big bumps on the EEG that are from the target stimuli, but not the non-target stimuli. And you also see on the bottom here, there's a figure that indicates the accuracy. And so one way that we improve accuracy is by having a very large number of stimuli and their responses averaged together before we actually output a response. So in this example, on the x-axis, you have the number of vibrations, that is the number of stimuli that occurred. And on the y-axis, you have the system accuracy. And you can see that after about 2 or 3 vibrations, once you average those EEGs together, those P300s or non-P300s, then you attain 100% accuracy. And this is an example of data from a healthy user. And usually with healthy people, you don't need anything close to 30 averaged stimuli. In the first paper way back in 1988, they used averages of only 15 stimuli. And there are a lot of papers out today with averages of maybe 2 or 3. Some people can do single trial P300s. It's possible under some circumstances and with some people. There's also, of course, the trick of just presenting stimuli until you get the data that you want. So this is, a system where you have one stimulus or one group of stimuli, and you say, hey, is that a clear enough difference? And if it's not, the system will automatically present more. And regarding this image, I should also note that all of these people are actors. So this person here wearing a cap is not a real patient. This person, I'm told, is actually a television star in Austria, and I don't know more about that. But none of these people are actual doctors or patients. We just did this to create an illustration, and also it avoids any concerns with privacy. So if you pay actors to be here, then you don't have to get into ethical issues with printing their image in a public document like this. So let me look at some of the results of the system. So here it says that with the BCI at 100%, it's perfectly accurate, and 0% means, importantly, it doesn't mean that the patient is not there, or it doesn't tell you a lot. If the system is highly accurate, that does tell you quite a lot about the patient. But if it's not, that doesn't tell you much. That is, it could be that your system is broken, it's not working somehow. It might very well be the person is asleep. Maybe the person just doesn't feel like doing anything at that time. To be more clear, if the accuracy is 0%, that's actually a little suspicious, because that's well below chance accuracy. And so we are using a pretty conservative threshold with the accuracy above 60%. And again, this is with averages of 30 stimulus trains, so 30 target stimuli, and actually a lot more than 30 non-target stimuli. And so the more of these you average together, the more reliable your accuracy is. So if you're accurate above a certain threshold, which is the chance accuracy in this is 12.5%, then that's pretty reliable. But again, especially with very important questions, you have to consider the system inaccuracies here. So if you're asking questions such as whether the person wants to continue to be alive, and yes, this does become an issue with many of these types of patients. Or do they want to remain married? Do they want to move to a different hospital? Do they want to change their care? Of course, with questions like these, you're going to use certain tricks to make sure that the answer you get is correct. For example, one thing you'll do is you'll ask the question two different ways, where in one case the answer would be yes, and the other time the answer would be no. So if you say, do you want to get a divorce? And the person says yes, you might also then ask, do you want to remain married? And so if the person just keeps saying yes over and over again because of a problem with the system, then you wouldn't go through with that. So obviously the first question you'd answer yes, the second question you'd answer no. And yes, unfortunately, this does also happen. That is, some people, when they're in this state, we've seen that the spouse or other family members are not very loving. They choose to abandon their family member. And in such cases, you, of course, want to respect the will of the patient. And in this page, we had some nice examples of success stories. But I also want to emphasize, like I've been saying for a while, the system is not perfect. It's a new technology. There are a lot of ways it could be improved. One thing is that the article talks about having a distractor on the leg. This is the vibrotactile stimulus with 3 approaches. And I've been telling my co-authors for years now, this is unnecessary. It results from a misunderstanding of the whole distractor approach. You should read an article, Gonzalez and Polish, 2002. But I'm only one author here, and I have amazingly little influence over the ERP paradigms that are used here. And we talk about future work. And so, as it says, we're going to keep making the BCI system smaller and easier to use. And we have new ways to interact with patients, like going beyond yes and no. We talked about that, although we still don't have it. And this also relates to problems with the overall speed of development. So like the other authors, I'm of course frustrated that we can't do more and do it more quickly. Well, but where is the money coming from? We're not charging these patients medically for this kind of thing. To publish this article, we don't get royalties from this. Most of the articles in Frontiers, you have to pay them. Not Frontiers Junior, those are free from Frontiers. And the company that makes these, they're not a huge company, and unfortunately there's not such a big market for these kinds of devices because there aren't very many patients in the world that need this kind of technology. So a lot of the funding to develop this kind of thing and to pay people who used to work on it, such as me when I worked on it, is coming from federal grant funding, essentially from tax money, and there's just not a lot of available money there. And so this is why you don't see more development and faster development of these kinds of technologies. It's certainly not that we don't have ideas or ways to improve, or that we don't want to. and very definitely not that we aren't frustrated that we're unable to advance the technology more quickly. And that's also a reason why I decided to make videos like these, because I can do more to advance the field by encouraging and informing other people to work on it than I can by doing the work directly myself. Not sure if that's good or bad, but there it is. And just to comment on a bit of material toward the end, so this here is the original source article. So if you want to see a much more difficult article written for experts, then this is it. And we have a couple references here. These are two textbooks that we mentioned earlier on. And so in publications like these, you have references at the end. Usually you have a lot more references, but because this is an article for junior readers, we didn't get too carried away with them. There are lots more references in the original source article. And regarding the conflict of interest statement, I should say that this is still true for me. So what I said in 2018 remains true. I don't make any money from this system. If you buy this system, I don't get commission. I don't work for the company. I don't get paid in any way. As I mentioned, if people read this article, it doesn't affect me financially. We don't get royalties. Of course, it affects me in other ways, such as I published the article because I want people to learn. The same reason I make this video. It makes me happy, and especially for helping younger people. So most of us were science-y nerds or medical nerds when we were kids. So we authors here, maybe we were like you earlier. We liked science. We did well in science classes and engineering classes. And I had people when I was younger who influenced me, who made me want to go into science. And I wish that we had things like this when I was a kid. I wish we had these kinds of publications and videos. And so if you're thinking that maybe you want to work on BCIs, especially BCIs to help people, well, great. I hope I've had some influence on you. And I also want to thank the reviewers. So this was unique in that we were reviewed by a person who was 12 years old. And this is appropriate because we wanted to make this fitting for 12-year-old people. And if you don't know how this system works, we don't choose the reviewer. That is, we didn't know this person before we made this article, and we still don't. We don't have contacts with this person who reviewed us. That's something that the journal decides, because of course, if we got to choose who reviewed our articles, well then that would lead to a lack of objectivity. We might say, well, we want this person. For example, Christoph Guger has a daughter who's about this age right now. You say, hey, I want my daughter to review it. Well, that's not fair. We want someone who's objective, who will have comments and criticisms and try to help us make the article better. And at the end of the article is a list of the people who are involved in producing this article. And part of what I want to comment on here is the interdisciplinary and international nature of my co-authors. So I was trying to say that if you're interested in BCIs, there are different ways that you can be involved. And you see people here coming from different backgrounds and disciplines. So the first author is my old friend Christoph Guger. And as it says, he's from a small town in the mountains of Austria that is a couple hours south of Germany. And if you're saying, wait a second, Australia is much further than that from Germany, I remind you of this word here, Austria, which is not the same as Australia. And Christoph's background is in biomedical engineering. And he's also the CEO of a company that makes these types of devices. And then the next author is someone with a very different background. Rosella Spataro is from Agrigento in Sicily. She's Italian, and her background is in medicine. She's a medical doctor and also a neurologist, and she also has a PhD in neuroscience. So she's very, very highly educated, and she's one of the doctors who works directly with the patients. So Christoph Guger, like me, is a PhD. He's not a medical doctor, and so he doesn't work directly with patients unless you also have a medical doctor involved. My background is in cognitive science, mostly with EEG, and I'm from Southern California. So we've got a few different countries already. These two people, Dr. Heiliger and Dr. Ortner, are also PhDs, so they're not medical doctors. They're experts in engineering and related work. So Dr. Heiliger studied biophysics, and he, like Dr. Ortner, were mainly involved as programmers. So they were critical in the software for these systems. And going down further, we have someone from a different region. This is Woo-Sang Cho, and he is from Korea. He got his PhD in Germany. And finally, the last author, Vincenzo Labella, is a colleague of Dr. Spataro's, and so they work together in Italy, and he is also a medical doctor and a neurologist. And finally, I want to conclude by thanking the two people here who help with video production. So Dr. Alexander Valume is not shown here, but he can edit in a picture of himself, and he's the one who helped change this file from just me talking to something with nice backgrounds and images. And then second, actually I don't know, so I will find out who the next person is, but at least Alex is going to help me with this. And again, this was just a practice video for me. Went pretty well overall. I was going to talk about the author queries, but in retrospect, when I make another version of this, I don't think I will, because it's just sort of unnecessary detail. And I'm now just doing a real-time analysis of what I did right and wrong. I did not follow the order of the paper that well. I was jumping around, which is not necessarily bad. Obviously, I chose to organize this paper in a certain way. And by the way, when I say I, like, yeah, I wrote this paper. Like, everybody else is on here because they're on the original source article. I wrote this paper, so I'm responsible. So here is the abstract, and I shouldn't really start with the abstract because that's just an overview. So I talked about these two terms pretty early on, BCI and EEG. Then I made the mistake of talking about visual BCIs without referencing this image here. I think that this image and the first image are both really good. I like this just because it's cartoony, and it may not be bad to jump around the article so much. I'm thinking about it. I described how the system works. And yeah, toward the latter part, I was much better at following the structure here. So when I got to the results, I presented them much more diffusely. And that's okay, because again, I don't want to just overlap the paper. And I talked about other examples. And notably, I don't have any kind of script. I don't know if other experts have those. I could, of course, write a script and follow that, but in this case, I was just more or less following the material on this paper. All right, so I guess that's it. I'm going to stop sharing and